Good morning. Klaus told me that he didn't want to interrupt me, but he just did. So I think that's a signal that we have to start the session. We have a very nice meeting room. So, unless you have a reason to believe that you will leave, when a speaker speaks, feel free to come, closer if you want. Thanks, Klaus, for picking this meeting room for us. I think that's, a sign that you have all these speakers today in very high esteem. So I think that's the nicest meeting room we have in the bank. I suspect many of you... Mm-hmm. I suspect many of you probably come from Europe and have a jet lag, and that might be the reason why you're here. At 8 o'clock, it's a little bit unfair to start a meeting that early. But we have a very nice panel. That's probably also what attracts you here today. So I'm Olivier Duprier. I'm Deputy Chief Statistician at the bank. I'm here sitting on behalf of the Chief Statistician, who is on mission this week. And so I'll have the pleasure to be the MC for these 4 speakers. We have 4 speakers, but they represent, I just counted 24 different authors. So we have 4 presentations, 4 papers, 24 brains behind that. So there's a lot of wisdom and science, I'm sure, in these presentations. It will be really nice. Because we're a small group, I suspect the group might expand a little bit, in the coming minutes or hour. But let's take it relatively casually. I think we have the luxury to have a nice room and a relatively small audience. So I'm going to ask the speakers to take about 20 minutes for the presentation, and that will be followed by question and answers, 5-10 minutes for each speaker, and then at the end, if we still have time, we can continue the conversation. So we're going to proceed close in the order that was put on paper. So the first speaker will be Remi Jedwab. I'm going to read his bio because I only had this morning the pleasure to meet him. I don't know much about him yet. So he's an associate professor of economics and international affairs at the Elliott School of Departments of Economics at GW, next door. He got his PhD in economics from the Paris School of Economics and was also a visiting PhD student at the London School of Economics for 3 years. His main fields of research are development and growth, urban economics, public economics, and political economy. Some of the issues he has studied include urbanization, structural transformation, relationship between population growth and economic growth, economic effect of transportation infrastructure, the roles of institutions, human capital, and technology in development. His research has been published in the American Economic Review, Review of Economics and Statistics, Economic Journal, Journal of Economic Growth, and the Journal of Urban Economics. Recently, his research areas have included the phenomenon of urbanization without economic growth, and his research has been highlighted by the Atlantic City Lab and the Boston Globe. So, for your information, that was the longest bio. The other ones will be short. Impressive CV. So, Remi,
yeah, all right.
If the technology is with you.
Does it work? Can you hear me? Great, okay. All right, so my name is Remi Jedwab. I'm from GW, just across the street, actually. I do a lot of work with World Bank as well. I'm going to pen 2 papers. The first one called Outward and Upward Construction, a 3D analysis of a global building stock. 3 co-authors, Thomas Esch, who is in the room here, Klaus Eninger, who is here with us as well, and the organizer of the conference, and Daniela Palacios Lopez, who is not here with us. So what we do is we update the World Settlement Footprint 3D database. There was a first version that was created by Thomas Esch and co-authors 2 years ago, and they were creating a new version. I'm going to tell you about the data very shortly. But more or less what we do is we use satellites plus industry-level data to provide global information on building area and heights for all the buildings in the world. The data is for the years 2012, 2019, so think of the 2010s. It's not a panel, but it's going to be a panel in the future, hopefully. The resolution is 12 by 12 meter, but we have a publicly released version of the data which is 90 by 90 meter. Okay, and there's a link here. You can always, email us and we'll give you the link. And we use the data to establish new status facts on construction across income levels, regions, and countries. And we focus on urban areas and also estimate possible construction needs. So let me tell you about the data. So what the WSF 3D team did was to use satellite SAR data to 3D map all the buildings in the world. The way it works is that you have a SAR satellite. It's going to send a signal. The signal is going to hit a structure like a building. It's going to bounce back and be captured by a second satellite. And this way you can measure like the topography of all the cities and buildings in the world. The problem with that analysis is that when you're like in cities where you have a lot of skyscrapers and dense build-up, the SAR signal is going to be mismeasured, and then error is going to have error in heights. So like in a city like New York City or Singapore or Hong Kong, that methodology is not perfect. Okay. So what we do is that we're going to correct the first version of the data using endpoints data on heights. So I'm going to tell you about endpoints in one slide. But the V1 version means 2% of global volumes and 9% of volume in large cities. So really like that correction is very important for like very dense cities where you have a lot of volume and a lot of economic activity. So this is endpoints. It's a provider of skyscraper and high-rise building data. They get data from the largest banks in the world and largest developers in the world. And then this is, for example, for Dubai. You have different dots. If you click on a green dot, that's a building. This is a Burj Khalifa in Dubai. And it shows you that you have a height and so on. So we can use this data to correct the world settlement footprint 3D V1 data. So here on the top right, the top here, you have building height V1 of New York City. And this is V2. And you can see the V2 has more red. It's just because with a correction, we better capture tall buildings in the center of cities. Okay, and then you can have a better estimation of volume, and then you can do it for all the cities in the world. And where you're going to have more red is where you have more like heights, more volume overall. Okay, and this way you can also see that cities have different shapes. This is a map of the world. As I said, the data that's been released is 90 by 90 meter. That's more or less half a US block. Okay, all right. So in terms of science facts. The first thing we want to know is like to what extent like volume or construction per capita is changing across countries as a function of income. I made a mistake in that slide. That's not build-up area. That's volume per capita. And so what you're seeing that overall, like as countries develop, you're going to get more volume per capita. Like we're in DC, we see a lot of volume. We don't see a lot of people in the room. So like that's volume per capita. Okay. But this is like increasing with income. And for like low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, it's kind of flat. Okay, it's only when you pass the cutoff that then you really have an increase in construction. So if you think of like India is building a lot, it's because it's like an upper middle-income country almost. So like you're really at that level where construction is booming. Okay, and China as well. So you have this convex relationship. Something I want to say as well: that rural areas account for like 60% of global volumes. Okay, and only 40% of population. Rural areas are not very efficient in terms of volume per capita. Actually, cities are very efficient. The cities we know concentrate more economic activity, but we also use less volume per capita, if anything, than the countryside. So I think that's an important point, which is like, cities are always criticized for a lot of things, but actually we're more efficient in terms of volume. Volume only explains 70% of a global variation. So like if you do a very simple regression, income is just 70% of the global relationship, but you have a lot of deviations around the line, and so you have 30% of the variation that is not explained by income, but explained by other things, typically land use regulations. Okay. So you have large differences for a given income level, and therefore like regulations, and then some of these differences are going to be due to height restrictions, like some countries and cities are against tall buildings. We're in DC, we don't see a lot of tall buildings. Most of the buildings are going to stop at like 13 floors, because that's a regulation in DC. And other cities are going to have like urban containment policies. They don't want the cities to sprawl and all of that. But we can classify all the countries in the world and all the cities in the world based on these different dimensions. And so we can have countries that have poor height, poor area. And when they have height, it can be poor high-rise building or poor low-rise building. And all of that, this is for a given income level. Okay. So countries like top right, like China, Spain, Germany, are going to be more like poor heights. And poor high-rise on top left, countries are more like poor area. You're going to have the US, obviously, but also France, Argentina, Mexico, South Africa, and they tend to be more poor high-rise when they have heights. So they don't have a lot of heights, but when they have height, these heights tend to be tall buildings. On the bottom right, you're going to have countries that are more poor heights, but they're poor low-rise for their height. So like Bangladesh, Egypt, Morocco. So when they have buildings, they're like dense cities, but these dense cities, the buildings are not very tall. Think of like 6, 7 floors and all that. And then bottom left, you're going to have poor area and poor low-rise. So these are like flatter cities, flatter countries. So you're going to have Nigeria, Pakistan, Kenya, and so on. And then we can classify different regions of the world. We're going to find that Asia, which is in green, is going to be more like poor height and poor high-rise. And then the rest of the world is more like poor area relative to Asia. But then you have differences for a different level of poor area. So Australia, North America, Northern Europe are more poor high-rise for the heights. Central America, South America are more in the middle. In Africa, it's more at the bottom. But that's more or less in line with what we had here at the country level. But we can classify the regions in the world. This is, again, for given income level and so on. And then we can classify individual cities. Top right of the US, most US cities are going to be poor area. But for the height that they have, they tend to be more poor high-rise. But you have some exceptions, like New York City, here DC as well, and Boston, are more poor heights in our classification. And China is going to be more poor heights. So really, like two different urban models. Okay, like anyone who has been to China in the past few years knows that Chinese cities are different from US cities. But if you go to a country like Brazil or a country like India, you have a mix of cities. So Brazil is like Sao Paulo is more like an American city, and then you go to more like a Chinese city, sorry. And then you go to Rio de Janeiro, which is more like an American city. And then you go to India, Mumbai, Bangalore are more like Chinese cities. I mean, they're getting towards China. But then in cities like Delhi, Kolkata, they're more like US cities, okay? Like more like sprawling and all that. And then you can classify the largest cities in the world and see where they are. And this has implications for like, economic development, aggregation economies, social relationships, and the environment. Okay, so like we don't really talk about like, the implications, but we think that we need to know about city shape and so on. But what we can do as well is like we can measure like construction needs. So here, for example, is like countries. We can identify countries doing better volume-wise. So like for a given income level, do you have more construction than other countries, or do you have less construction than other countries? So you have less construction. So if you're below the line here for your income level, I mean that potentially you have a need. Like you're not building as much as the other countries of the same income level. So for example, like India is lower than the line, Colombia is lower than the line, Pakistan is lower than the line. So maybe these countries are not building as much for the given income level. We can also identify countries going to have needs in terms of future construction. For example, like we know, like if you know the future income of countries, we know they're going to move along the line. So we can predict what's going to be the consumption of like volume, like concrete, steel over the next decade. Likewise, if we know the future population growth of countries, we can also predict like, okay, like by how much demand is going to increase over time. So I think that's a useful tool to predict like future demand for like construction materials and all that. And then I've been doing, so we can classify current needs. Right now it's like the needs are driven by mostly Asia and Latin America. African nations do not have large construction gap as of right now because most African countries are like the bottom left. In the bottom left, they don't have a lot of variation for a given income level. So if you take the best countries in terms of construction for their income level, it's not that different from the worst countries. So like African countries are not very far from these best countries. So the gap is going to be driven by these countries here, just like below the line. And most of them are in Asia and Latin America. But this is for right now. But if you look at the future in the next few years, the construction needs are driven by Asia because you have a lot of income growth, like India is an example. But if you look in a very long run, in 30 years, the construction needs in the world are driven by Africa because you're going to have a lot of population growth. The last thing I want to say is that there's a big trade-off between housing affordability and the environment. I mean, we want more volume so we can lower housing prices. Great. But at the same time, if you have more volume, you generate more carbon emissions. So we did some quantification, and we show like, if you meet all these construction needs, you're going to increase carbon emission by so much, and the numbers are quite big. Okay, so that's where it gets scary because like, if India is building to the level of like the line, then you're going to really have more carbon emissions in the world. So that's it for that paper, and I take a few minutes for the other paper. So from that first paper, we did a very simple analysis on spatial distribution of building volumes for 7,000 world cities. What we do more or less, we characterize an urban form for all the cities in the world. This is an example of New York City, Chicago, and LA. They have a very steep gradient. So as you're getting away from the center, heights are going to fall very fast. But you have differences across cities. Like Chicago is more like heights are very tall in the center. It doesn't use as much area. New York City is less tall in the center, but it's going to use more area. And LA is much less tall in the center. It's going to use much more area. So you have 3 cities with different shape. We can quantify this volume density gradient for all cities in the world, and we can study the determinants of these volume gradients. To do this analysis, we need to know the center of cities. So we do an analysis where we try to find the historical center of all the cities. We use different sources for that. We also have a volume-based center, so we can use our volume data to find the center. And then we can also look at lights. I can tell you the historical center and the volume-based center are usually very consistent with each other. The light centers are not very reliable. So if anything, we're telling you that, okay, if you're using lights to define the center of the city, it's not that great. It's better to use volume. It's a better measure. And then you get these different gradients. I can show you that the MENA here, for example, cities are more flatter. They're not small cities. Cairo is a really big city, but it has a relatively flat gradient. And Istanbul as well. Istanbul is a very polycentric city. So it's not like a really like a steep city like, I don't know, like Tokyo or even Shanghai. What is a volume gradient? So what you do is this very simple regression where for each city 1 by 1 in 500 meters distance mean, you regress a log volume density on distance. You're getting the minus gamma, and the minus gamma is a measure more or less of the steepness of a gradient. So this is a measure that's been used in a lot of urban studies, and you can see the gradient is flatter or steeper for each city in the world. And then we do a simple analysis where we see what are the determinants of gradients. This is my last slide. So we find that a city that is bigger is going to have flatter gradient. Why? Because as you get a bigger and bigger city in terms of population, you're going to have this more endogenous formation of CBDs, like central business districts. So New York City has 5 or 6. And so as the city is getting bigger, you're going to get more of them appearing. And as more of them appear, the gradient is going to become flatter. Also wealth. So if a city is wealthier, people consume more housing, you're going to get more suburbanization. People are going to have cars, so then you're going to have a flatter city. Transportation infrastructure as well, like subways and highways, are going to increase area. As you increase area, it leads to more outward development, therefore you're getting a flatter gradient. However, if you control for the area effect, subways are going to lead to a steeper gradient. So controlling for the area effect, once you have subways, the inside of the city is going to be more centralized heights and so on. So in that case, if you care about city form, subways are better than highways. We're also looking at the effect of segregationist policies. Think of South Africa, think of Zimbabwe and so on. So we can see if in the past you had policies that were leading to more segregation, the cities are flatter as a result. And so it's yes. There have been some studies for Cape Town and Johannesburg, more or less you had areas that was more for the whites and areas that was more for the blacks. And so you had different sub-centers, and therefore the city was flatter and more polycentric as a result. That's still what we find today. We're able to find that for all South African cities, not just 2 cities, because we have all cities in the world. Likewise, former colonies of Anglophone countries, there's some studies showing that the French colonies and the British colonies have different urban planning. In the British colonies, we see more of these flatter cities. I just came back from Singapore. In Singapore, there's this policy where some areas were for the British, some areas for the Indians, some areas were for the Chinese, some areas for the Malays. So really that you have these different ethnic neighborhoods, different sub-centers, and because of that you have a flatter city because you have a more polycentric city. We don't find that former communist countries have flatter gradients. There was a big literature on that 30 years ago, showing that if anything, the cities were developing on the outside, because that's where they were building new cities with these apartment blocks. With 30 years later, 30 years of market economy, if anything, they're not flatter anymore. And historical cities from before the 20th century are flatter. If you think of cities like Paris, there is no development in the center. Paris hasn't changed in a century. That's more like a museum. All the development is happening outside. Therefore, it's getting more flatter. But if you think of historical cities from the turn of the 20th century, they're steeper. Why? Because that's when you had the first skyscrapers. This was before the car era. So in that case, you get steeper cities. And then the cities that were built after the 70s, really grew after the 70s, or after the 50s, they're much flatter gradient because they're based on cars like LA and so on. So you see really important differences driven by economic determinants and non-economic determinants. So yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
Many thanks, Remi. So we're going to take, 5-10 minutes for Q&A. I don't know if anyone already has a question. If you can just say who you are, and then ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just the one on the left, just below the mic, yeah.
Okay. I'm Jennifer Alex Garcia from Oregon State University, and I just had a couple questions about the product itself, the remote sensing product. So I'm wondering, is this, well, I have two, I'm going to do sub-questions. So my broad question is it a wall-to-wall product? If it's not, how did you select the cities, and how do you define the edge of a city? Thanks.
You want to answer the question, Thomas?
Yes, I can answer this question. So basically, it's a wall-to-wall product. So it's globally available at this 90-meter resolution for all the land surface. So you can, even with the link that Remi provided, download it. And the city boundaries we took from the Joint Research Center, JRC, they have an urban cluster database, and they separated these cities based on the population density and distribution. So it's a kind of also documented, reported methodology. Although at the moment, as Remi showed as well, we're also testing if one might optimize this, because this is still in parts not the perfect representation of a city if you go for the population density. So we now also try to test if we include the volume, for instance, and also the temporal growth over the last 30 years that we can also derive from remote sensing data, if we can find automatically, let's say, the best fitting city centers, and then also go for new definition of the clusters in case. But this is still ongoing work. Michael.
Any other question? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Bruno Conte from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, and I had a question related to this sort of statistics or accounting exercise you did along the income dimension on different types of volume per capita and other statistics. And I wonder whether you also tried or you plan to eventually study these sort of patterns along a sectoral dimension, because income captures many of the aspects, right? But especially if we think about how the developing world is developing, it's very different from what, I don't know, developed economies of nowadays did in terms of which sectors they specialized into, transition to industry and then to services. Right now, many developing countries are developing already towards services industries, which then have different degrees of agglomeration forces. As a consequence, I guess, then how would be the shape of these cities as these countries develop? Thanks.
Did it work? Yeah, I think that's a great comment. Like what we see with Chinese cities, some of them can be very polycentric because they have a manufacturing area that is developing outside the old city center. So there's like two cities in the same city. But then the bigger cities are going to be specialized in services. So then, and services tend to be more central, like in skyscrapers and all of that. So like, I think you can have a bimodal distribution within the same country depending on the stage of development. I haven't done any analysis, but that's something we could do here and add the stage of structural transformation and the sectors will be very interesting.
One thing, sorry, just came to my mind now is that also if there is any sort of classification along different types of industries, one might be interested to know cities that are more or less exposed to remote working, because I guess this would have also an important push factor from cities in terms of urban sprawl and these sort of things.
This data is from before, but you could do a prediction.
Oh, yes.
So if you know like the sectoral composition, remote work, that measure of remote workness of Jonathan Dingle, you can do it for all cities in the world, and then you can predict which ones are going to be like impacted by that, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
I don't know if we can abuse my status as chair to ask a related question. Maybe a naive one. You know, when I attend this kind of session, I always regret not to be a geographer, but I'm a demographer, so I count people, not volumes. This is fascinating data, but have you tried to merge this data also with other type of data, like census data sets, for example? Because I mean, if you look through the window, you see a lot of volume, but you don't see one residential building. So do you have any way to qualify the volume by industrial, residential, office?
That's a very good point. So a lot of past studies, they didn't have volume data, so they were using population density data, like census data. And then they will show this, what they call the crater effect, where in the center you don't have population because people don't live here. And then around like 3-4 kilometers, that's when population would pick up because that's where you get the residential buildings. So you go to Adams Morgan and so on here. I think here we're using volume. We cannot distinguish housing or commercial. But if you want to measure like the continuum of economic activity, I think it's good to use volume because volume is going to capture population during the day and population at night. So this is population during the day, this building. That's where we are. The census, they capture population at night. That's where people live. But the volume is capturing the continuity of like population during the day and population at night. I love censuses, but I think it's just capturing where people live, right? But most half of the week we spend where we work, and so that should be counted as well. I think our measure encompasses everything to some extent.
All.
Hi, Shohei.
Hi, my name is Shohei Nakamura from the World Bank. Thank you, Remi, for the great presentation. I have just a quick question. I was just wondering, whether you can distinguish kind of occupied and also vacant buildings. Particularly in China, I guess there are many ghost towns and then tons of tall high-rise buildings not really used for anything. And even like in some other countries, when I visited Rwanda, for example, the tallest building in the middle of the center was actually vacant. So yeah, I'm just wondering how that would also affect your findings here.
I mean, ghost cities in China is like 30, 40 cities, but we're talking 3,000 cities in China. And they don't have a lot of population, and so we use as weights the population of cities. So if they don't have population, they should not contribute to the overall analysis. But we can drop these ghost cities, like as you say, like in China. One building in LA is empty. That's true, but most buildings in the world are not empty. And so I think we should look at it's like the subways. You have some subways that no one uses and subways that people use, but we don't focus on. We still think the subway is a good technology because most people use subways. We don't focus on the one subway that is like empty, and because of that we say, hey, we don't care about subways, Oh. Should I stop? Oh.
I just wanted to ask about sort of comparison with nighttime lights because you mentioned the VIRs.
Yeah.
You mentioned the centroids, which I think that's I could investigate that for another 6 months. I think that centroid question is a good one, but in answer to sort of this idea of empty buildings or sort of less productive areas, have you looked at I don't want to say simple because it's fairly heavy data processing, but like the intersection of the volume with the nighttime lights data and what kind of choices are there?
So volume, light adjusted volume. That would be very interesting. I agree. I think the point with volume empty buildings, as you say, the point with lights is like you're going to capture Times Square, or like the water treatment facility or the airport. So that's the issue.
Certain huge industrial stuff
exactly.
is really bright.
But kind of like combining the strength of two measures, you could probably come up with a better measure. I agree. That's great.
Just maybe, last question if there's no other. What have you done to validate these data?
To validate?
Yeah, to assess, because I understand that you pixel is more or less the level of a block in the US.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent we have two databases. So we're going to have the endpoints, which is like industry level, and then we're going to have the satellite. So one is like from the ground, and the other one is from the sky. They're like really in sync with each other, except in the central areas of cities, where that's where the satellite doesn't work so well. So to some extent, it validates the data in the rest of the world. But Thomas wanted,
Yeah, we have run a global campaign. The problem or challenge here is, of course, that you need very high resolution building models to do so. But we could globally acquire that for a bit more than 20 cities, and then compared, like 1 meter building models with our estimations aggregated to the 90 by 90 meter. And there we could see that the average estimation error within this 90 by 90 meter cells was about, at the beginning in this version 1, -3 meters. So we roughly underestimated the average building height by 1 story. And now with the latest data, because most of these errors actually arose from the high-rise buildings that we couldn't properly cover, now we came down to an error of, I think, 20 centimeters in statistically. So, of course, you still have to look at the entire city if you go for a single pixel. So then we are still at the level of about 3 to 5 meters. Which is still, I think, for global estimation, quite good, and for many of these studies, reasonably accurate, let's say.
Klaus, I see the light in front of you. Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that, I mean, I think your suggestion of linking to censuses, both from the population side, but then also economic censuses, I think could be very interesting, because then if you have a population, you have the economic activity, and you have the heights. Bringing these three things together, I think, can give you a lot of leverage. And then to look at some of the issues that Bruno mentioned in terms of how does the volume per industrial activity, or how does that change across different settings and different stages of development. So I think there's definitely scope for potential collaboration there.
Okay, thank you. I guess that's a signal that we can move on to the... Thanks a lot again, Remi. So, next speaker will be my friend and colleague, Ben. So I'm still going to read his bio. If I find it, otherwise I'll just say that Ben is... did I lose it? No, I did not. So Ben is a senior geographer leading the Global Operations Support Team, the GHOST, in the Development Data Group at the World Bank. That's the department I belong to, so he's my friend and colleague. And his work has focused on introducing novel geospatial analytical techniques to World Bank Group operations, with a special focus on market access, network analysis, and remote sensing. So he's done a lot more than that, but the floor is yours, Ben.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Benjamin Stewart, Senior Geographer here at the bank. I specialize, and our team specializes in sort of generalized geospatial support to teams across the institution. So do a lot of work with electrification planning, and then for years I've done a lot of work with my colleague Shohei and Mark Roberts, who isn't here, on this idea of quantifying urbanization. Right? That's been a big part of what we've been doing going on a decade now, trying to find different ways to do that. So that's what I'll be talking about today, is I'll be talking about sort of the methods we use to estimate urban areas in Sub-Saharan Africa, and then Shohei will follow about, hey, so what do we do with this cool urban data in sort of World Bank numbers? So I just want to start with sort of the justification, right? Why are we trying to quantify urbanization? I pulled this slide from the first time I ever went to a country. We had a mission to Haiti to present the results to the government. And this was the slide we came up with to talk about why urbanization matters and why our consistent definitions of urban are important. So it might be a little out of date. But the idea being that really each country defines urban differently, right? Countries define urban in specific ways based on historical patterns, based on specific types of governance, and that leads to huge variation in what urban means. The specific examples are things like in Sweden, any settlement over 500 people is considered urban. In China, that threshold is 50,000 people. That's a huge difference, and if we just compare raw urban numbers between those reported statistics, we're going to get a huge amount of variation. I do want to start by saying, because I won't correct myself every time this happens, those definitions of urban are not wrong. Right? We are not trying to correct countries' national definitions of urban. Those definitions are used by those countries for specific governance matters. That's great. I think what we're trying to focus on is, one, a consistent measure of urban so that we can compare countries, because we can't with official numbers. And the second is, the bank really does have this outreach, this capacity building mentality with a lot of our client countries. And it's not that we necessarily want countries to adapt the specific definitions that we're providing. We want countries to consider quantitative definitions of urban. Right? So whatever the specific, there are lots of countries that we've been to where they have certain definitions of urban because that's how it has been for the last 60 or 70 years. And those haven't been updated, and there's no fixed definition. So this is really about defining what urban is and sort of moving that forward both with countries and in sort of the analytical frameworks. So talking about urbanization in Africa, it's urbanizing quickly, right? We've seen a 15-fold increase from 1961 to 21, and the urban share, and it's not just huge population growth, the urban share has jumped from 15% to almost 42%, huge change, right? And we expect by 2050 to be over 1 billion urbanites in Africa. But we don't know a lot about the detailed patterns of that urbanization, right? Part of it comes from the lack of official statistics on urbanization, right? That idea that, like, what does urban mean in your country? How do you define it? Is there a concrete definition? We don't have that information. We either don't have it currently, or we don't have it historically. The second reason that or sort of the third justification for this is just we have data now that allows this, allows us to do these kind of assessments, right? The availability of global, rigorous data on people and the built environment. The great work done by the World Settlement Footprint, their 3D products, their evolution products. There's lots of data that can tell us these things. I know, when I started at the World Bank over a decade ago, we were using land scan population grids that were 2 years out of date because that's when they became free to researchers. And that was our population data. Now we have the choice of, I put 3 gridded population data sets up there, but those are just 3 that are readily available. There are more, right? So we have so much more data available to us, and we can do so many more comparisons. So what do? Here we've got a map of the urban extents across Africa. We compared 2 methods of urbanization, right? We compared the degree of urbanization from the European Commission. This is a consistent threshold applied to gridded population data. And then we applied a second method that we're calling, or is called the dartboard method, which generates relative thresholds based on identifying, anyway, I'll go into the methodology in a second. But we compared these 2 methods across 3 population data sets. And for a couple of those, we did multiple years as well, then that's more part of Shohei's presentation. So we have a lot of different urban comparisons. When I get to the results, we're going to just be looking at the results for the dartboard methodology because I didn't want to present the paper 6 times and show how the results vary. But we did a lot of different comparisons and sort of chose the one that we thought that was the most interesting. Sort of what's the research justification here? I wanted to talk about the sort of 3 primary interrelated literatures that we're contributing to. The first is this idea of patterns of urbanization derived from satellite imagery, right? I don't think it's a stretch to say gridded population data is a remotely sensed product, right? I'll get into it a little bit, but it is, we get the population data from the countries and we disaggregate it down to pixels using generally a lot of remotely sensed products, right? So that's a big part of what we're doing there. Right, these ideas of methods for more accurate and consistent definition of urban areas, right? There are some methods that we leverage quite regularly. The degree of urbanization is probably the one that I default to, but this dartboard methodology is very interesting and has some advantages over the degree of urbanization, as well as some disadvantages. And finally, just this descriptive literature on urban systems and the internal structure of cities. I think one of the things that we're looking at, and again, I'm glad the WSF was presented the 3D product was presented right before me, because I think traditionally, again, 10 years ago, we were just talking about what is the city? And specifically, actually, talking about nighttime lights. I always used to caution people, don't take the inter-city variation in nighttime lights too seriously, right? The DMSP blooms, it has a lot of, you've got gradients. The fact that this area is a little brighter than this area, don't take that too seriously. That's just a factor of the sensor. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. I think we're getting better data. There's high-resolution nighttime lights data. We've got 900-meter height data. That is sort of wild to the imagination. So we can learn about the workings of the city on a global scale in a way we never used to be able to. So just talk quickly about the 2 methods. The first is DEGURBA, or degree of urbanization. This is a consistent approach to urban area shape delineation. Right, so we apply 2 thresholds. So there's 2 categories of urban, and we apply 2 thresholds to both of them. We have the yellow areas. These are urban areas, a minimum pixel density of 300 people per square kilometer. And then when you group contiguous cells of that density, that settlement has to have at least 5,000 people. Right, that's the minimum to be an urban area, and that's not very big. A town of 5,000 people that's separated from a city is a fairly small place. So I think that's worth keeping in mind when we say urban in this. It's not just mega cities. There's some sort of smaller areas that are also considered urban. And then you have in the red the high density clusters. These are really, again, the real cities, the dense cores, the real areas, and it's minimum population density of 1,500 people per square kilometer. And then when you group contiguous cells, you have to have a total population of at least 50,000 people. Right? So those are the 2 methods for the degree of urbanization. And those thresholds are applied consistently. Right? So we apply the same threshold in, last year I was in Namibia for 2 weeks. If anyone's ever been, that place is empty. It's the least densely populated place in the world. Compare that to something like the Nile in Egypt, like that, it's just huge population densities, and the degree of urbanization applies the same methodology to both places, right? There's some advantages to that, some disadvantages. The dartboard methodology identifies population density peaks, right? So a pixel is each individual pixel is compared to 3,000 random reshuffles, so a sort of a distribution of randomness. And if it's in the 95th percentile of those random pixels, it's considered urban. So that's what we see here on the map. All the colored pixels are urban pixels. There's a next step to identify these city cores, which we see in red. And that same reshuffling process is done, but just using the pixels already defined as urban. Right? So we identify sort of statistically relevant cells as urban. Then within those, we do that reshuffling again, and that's where you get these dense urban cores. So yeah, that's the sort of the three categories. And and then you get those, the orange areas are essentially urban settlements that have a core, right? So you've got the yellow ones, there's no core. Orange is a city, an urban city with a core, and then the red part is the real dense part of the city. So those are sort of the three categories. And the most important here is that it's a relative approach to these urban area delineations, right? This is the thresholds that like whatever the population density changes with the randomizations and changes with the, hope they're all right. Changes with the country and changes with the nature of the population in those places. Talk a little about the data we used. We focused here in this presentation on the constrained WorldPop 2015 data. So if you're familiar with how gridded population data is created, right, we take census information at the highest possible resolution and then sort of put the people in those sort of polygonal areas down to pixels based on other geospatial covariates. So whether that's things like road density, building density, nighttime lights brightness, presence of forest, right, land cover. There's lots of different factors that can affect where you put people in those considerations. So that's how that's the general WorldPop equation. The constrained WorldPop adds a constraint that you can only put people where there is built area. And that built area is derived from the Digitize Africa building footprints data commissioned by the Gates Foundation many years ago. It's a pseudo-public data set, but it's essentially, what they use it for is a map of built area, right? The idea is like, well, yeah, we're going to push people down based on all these geospatial covariates, but they can probably only live where buildings are, so we're only going to put them where buildings are, and that's a constrained WorldPop data set. It's very good. I quite like it. So we're doing this for 2015. That'll become more apparent why in Shohei's presentation when he talks about sort of the implication for integration into household survey information. For the dartboard methodology, the only other layers we used was that when you do that random reshuffling, you only reshuffle the habitable pixels, right? So we eliminate pixels that are uninhabitable. I think that there is potential to really explore what uninhabitable means. For us, it was fairly simple. It was water bodies and deserts from the European Space Agency's globe cover product, and then very steep or very high elevation places. Those are the two areas that were sort of said, nope, people can't live there. We'll move on. So, some results. African countries are more urbanized than their official statistics claim. You can see here, the 45-degree line in the middle, all the countries are above. So we've got 45 out of 47 countries are more urbanized than their official statistics would claim. We do have two outliers, CPV and STP. I had to look up CPV. I didn't know that one right off the top of my head. I knew Sao Tome. Cabo Verde and Sao Tome, which, if you've done a lot of sort of regional studies of Africa, they're two small island developing states off the coast. And I would argue that in a lot of our global studies, small island developing states sort of fall as outliers. The data might not be as accurate in these places. There's lots of reasons, but all the continental countries sort of fall into this category of they are more urbanized than we think that they are. I've got two maps highlighting this. On the left here, we see a bivariate choropleth map showing the measured, that's our calculated, urbanization in the red gradient. The blue gradient shows the official calculation. Bivariate choropleth maps, I think, are interesting, and in some ways they're more confusing than they are useful. But we see different trends across the continent, and then on the right we see where are the places that are higher and lower. So the places in pink actually have a higher official reported statistics, and then the blue are places that have where our quantified measure is much higher than the other one. So you can see, there's even sort of across the continent differences, right? West Africa is different than sort of Eastern and Southern Africa, and what does that mean? There's lots of interesting potential there. So getting down to the, there we go. some of the conclusions. In Africa, urban dwellers live in dense cities rather than towns, right? So if you come back to that yellow, orange, and red map, they're much more in the orange and red. It's not secondary, not tertiary, not, you know, I think of bedroom communities in Virginia where people, you know, commute into DC. We don't have that. They're really going into major cities, and we see that across the place. And with the sort of the companion fact there is that within those cities, more than 2/3 of the population lives in even denser cores. So it's not just that they're going to the orange areas, they're actually going to the red, dense cores of the city as opposed to sort of, you know, what I would, you know, American-style suburban development. They really are going into the center of the city. I think this is one that could be, I would like to have the data from the 3D to redo some of this analysis, because I think we could get some really interesting results. But we find that, unlike in developed countries, the built-up area doubles with urban area population, right? So we find that these places, as they're growing, that per capita footprint is much larger in African cities. They're expanding more as people come in. We don't see the sort of densification we see in a lot of developed countries. We see sprawl. I mean, maybe like you would see in a lot of American cities. But they do not appear from suffer from excessive primacy, right? So it isn't that there's a single huge city that everybody's flocking to. You can see here on the left, we've got the African numbers. On the right, I think that's all OECD countries. I'd have to go back and see what we tabulate that from. But there's not a substantial difference, right? The percentage of people that live in the largest primate city it isn't that different from the rest of the world. And here on the map on the right, you can see sort of that orange slice on the right side shows the percentage of the total population of the largest city. And again, there's different patterns all across the continent, but nowhere do we get these really, we don't get any sort of exceptionally high numbers. Also, most cities in Africa are monocentric, right? So we talked about, actually, Remi sort of brought this up a couple times, the idea, like, what is the city center? In this case, when we talk about monocentric for these data, you know, these two small cities that I've highlighted, they have one red circle inside their orange area, and then these are sort of two other physically similar sized cities, and they have sort of dueling cores that are not connected, right? So what does that mean? What is monocentric, you know, monocentric cities, you know, single core. When you have multiple cores, maybe you have maybe that's the result of expansion, agglomeration effects, right? Two cities growing into each other. There's lots of possible explanations, but we find most cities are monocentric. But some cities, including the largest, have a very large number of centers. And this is where we see places like Nairobi and Addis and Niamey. I know Nairobi is pretty well, but it has 500 cores, right? It has just all these, it has really expanded, and this is where we really get sort of the agglomeration, the super cities, the expansion of places. And I think that those are important to identify, because obviously there are novel policies necessary for identifying and working with those cities. So I just want to talk about a couple final conclusions. I think one of the reasons we really focus on urbanization is that significant numbers of people are unofficially classified or officially classified just incorrectly. And no matter what the definition of urban is being used for in a country, it's being used for something, right? Some amount of policy is being affected by urban definitions, and that will affect growth. I actually remember coming back to that story the first time I took this to Haiti. We were presenting and showing aggregations at like administrative level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4, sort of showing like as you go down the policy hierarchy, and once we get to level 4, a lot of the government statisticians were sort of up in arms, like, no, this makes no sense, this can't be right. And it turns out that every admin 3 has a single admin 4 where everybody pays taxes, but only one, because that's the urban admin 4 and this admin 3. So in our calculations, there were all kinds of places that like wouldn't pay taxes with this. We didn't know this until we started talking about our definitions, so we started presenting the results, but this was a very specific policy implication of what at the time had really been sort of an academic investigation. So I think that was a good example of how that definition of urban really matters, right? And I think there were reasons to get it right, I think. I think we need to target urban cores, especially in secondary and tertiary cities. I think if you go that map of Accra, there are a lot of small cities with cores, and I think, coming back to this idea of volume in 3D, we need to promote vertical development, especially, I mean, all across Africa, but even especially in secondary and tertiary cities where we don't see a lot of focus on that. I think that's a real opportunity. I think we need to slow the physical expansion of these cities by building up. Limitations, as I mentioned, this is just a single time period that we actually chose the time periods mostly in coordination with Shohei's work. So like 2015 is not really on time anymore. It's a little old. But we could easily rerun this, and we have for other dates. And then I'd also love to use the new DLR built-up data to see how that compares to some of our sort of built area estimations as we're currently working on them. Because it's a really interesting data set, and I think it meshes quite nicely with what we're doing. And yeah, and I think I'll stop there. Shohei's going to present a paper on sort of how we use these data integrated into more official bank statistics. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So open to questions. Yes, Satej, please.
This was a super interesting talk. I think some of these points have been known to urban researchers, but it's great to see some data. On your first finding, what do you think is driving kind of the distinction between the rates of urbanization you find and the officially reported thing? Is it the differences in what counts as urban, or is the rate of urbanization so fast that whenever you see a census and then whenever you remeasure, you've seen population growth or like additional building up, so that the census that's used to define urban areas is just out of date so quickly?
I think it's probably both.
Okay.
Right? I think it's a little of both, and it does vary greatly by country, right? I think that there are, like you say, as soon as any data set, as soon as you publish it, it's out of date because something else has come along. I think a big one for the places we're looking at is that they don't have quantitative definitions of urban, right? A lot of the Sub-Saharan African countries that we've worked with, I've provided census support to a couple places, and I remember specifically asking because they were preparing for, they completed the listing, they completed the national listing. And they were going to send people out to different sites, and how many enumerators they sent out were based on their urban and rural definitions, and nobody knew where it came from. Now, it wasn't nonsense. You look at the map and it made sense, but it wasn't. They didn't know why they defined places as urban and rural. But it affected the way that they were planning for the census, so it meant something. So we've been working, and I know the European Commission does a lot of work, like just trying to work with countries to get them to really codify a quantified measure of urban, maybe based on one of the methods we're using, but just based on anything, any data they have. But I think it's a little of both. I think there's both an incomplete definitions of urban, and then also, like you say, the places are changing so fast.
Hi, my name is Vaidehi. I'm from the University of Manchester. I had a follow-up question to something that you mentioned about the policy sort of experience with talking to statisticians and so forth. How much willingness have you seen in terms of taking on board these kinds of suggestions to quantify and move towards a quantitative definition?
When I get to talk to geographers, they're really excited about it. Right, when I talk to the person in the statistics office who actually has the ArcGIS license and does the mapping and planning and manages the EAs between, they're really interested in these data. They think they could be, because in some ways it's just another point of triangulation. When we've had conversations sort of further up the ranks, there's interest, but I think it gets political pretty quick. Like, what's the advantage for the politician for doing this? It's complicated, and somebody's going to be upset because their definition was changed for whatever reason. So. I think there's definitely appetite, right? Because the other aspect of it is that it's free and easy and has a potential benefit, right? There is also, it's sort of a why bother with this? What's the advantage of it? So that's where we really struggle. Is like sort of explaining to the head of the NSO, like, no, it's going to take a little bit of extra time and training. Here's all the tools and data. It's like, okay, but why? Why should I try and convince my government to put this into? And that's the other thing is, like, we've increasingly, like, this is a governance question more than any kind of data question or geography question or economics question.
I think in terms of quantifying, if you can sort of think about how transfers linked to urban-rural definitions are leading to misallocation of public finances, that could be a potential way. That's something that we've done for India, so just wanted to
I think the misallocation of finance and the sort of better targeting of programs is really important. I think that urban-rural gradient is kind of the most important one for most spatially aware policy implications, and I think we just need to need to focus more on getting that right.
Maybe following up on that, so I cannot speak here and look at you, Ben, so it's a bit uncomfortable. Have you, I mean, you say that Africa is more urban than based on the official definition. Have you produced a kind of confusion matrix to see if there are some areas that you define as urban that they don't, and vice versa? Because I mean, or is it that the official definition includes everything that you would consider as urban? And if you have indeed some kind of mismatch, to find a topic that might be sensitive and trigger attention, not just of GIS experts but others, have you tried to remeasure poverty using your definition? Or maybe that's a question for Shohei more than for you.
I think that's
measuring poverty, but not just what's the poverty rate. In Africa, a big component of the household expenditure is the estimate of the rental value of, owner-occupied dwellings. And in this regression, urban-rural is probably one of the very important variables. So if we use your definition instead of the official definition, would that change the poverty rate significantly? Because if it does, then you have another area that might trigger the attention of some politicians.
We'll table that longer discussion because again, Shohei will present an entire paper on that. But
okay, you have 1 minute to answer, and then Shohei can take 10.
So I do think I just wanted to look at. So one of the reasons. So yes, we've done this. We've done these comparisons. I didn't include any here. The other thing I did want to stress is that I'm presenting one result. I calculated 10,000 estimates of urban. Redid this so many times, ran it so many different ways. We did all kinds of comparisons between things. I think one of the biggest issues is that this is a 200 meter pixel level estimate of urban, and the comparison we're making is to some sort of administrative level vector data. So there's aggregation involved, and frankly we often just don't get the urban definitions from the countries at a level that makes that comparison super interesting, right? If it's administrative 2 level, right, like a county, if that's what we're able to get as far as urban-rural definitions from our country counterparts, I don't find that as interesting as, versus I actually have the enumeration areas for Ghana with that definition, right? I met someone at the census and they gave it to me. EA level stuff is really valuable. That's really interesting, but we generally just don't get access to it. But it is a a sort of a kappa coefficient, agreement coefficient. So we have looked at that. We just didn't present any of it here. Because it's not homogeneous differences, right? There are places and varies by country and varies by part of the country. So I think there's some interesting stuff there.
Okay, thanks. That's probably another area where census data might help, because the enumeration areas in census are either urban or rural by definition. Following the definition of the country. So I think we should make an effort to try to get more access to more of these, census microdata. We still have one question, and then we'll move on to Shohei.
Yeah, thank you. Thomas Esch from German Aerospace Center. So one question, do you have, or did you do any kind of sensitivity analysis? Because you mentioned it, at the moment you work with 200 meter resolution. So I could imagine if you work with 500 or 100, for instance, then the number of centers might significantly vary. The same is true if you vary with the thresholds. So just to get an understanding of what is the effect, for instance, on the urban centers definition, or also the identification of the number of sub-centers, let's say.
Yeah, so we did while running it, we ran it at 2 resolutions, at 250 meters and 1 kilometer, right? So we have it all for those 2 resolutions, and we have some results. We generally present one at a time, again, because it becomes sort of an overwhelming, but it is a good question, right? How does the resolution of the input data? Because we were actually talking about this when we were writing up the results. I don't remember why we chose 250 meters. It doesn't match any of the input data. None of our input data was 250 meters. I don't know why we standardized to that, but we did at the start, and it works pretty well. But the gridded population data is 100 meters, right? What happens when we go there? You would expect to probably see more settlements, because you can sort of identify splits between places, right? A lot of sort of 2 core cities become 2 monocore cities, right? So there could be those kind of results. But we generally found that the change in resolution did not affect the results terribly, right? It wasn't hugely different.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
We're perfectly on time. So, Shohei, he's also a colleague, so I also know him, but he's an economist in the Poverty and Equity Global Practice here at the World Bank, where he's been tackling poverty and urbanization agenda in various regions. He leads multiple works in poverty and inequality analysis and statistical capacity building in the Pacific region and conducts policy research to address global urban poverty challenges. He's also, he has extensively published articles on urban poverty, informal settlements, distributional impact analysis of infrastructure. And before joining the bank, he was a visitor fellow at Harvard Graduate School of Design. He has a PhD in urban and regional planning from the University of Michigan. So, Shohei-san, your turn.
Thank you, Olivier. Mic is on. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Shohei Nakamura from the World Bank. So, as Ben already mentioned, so I'm going to present, this research work, which is another output from the same World Bank research project, analyzing urbanization and poverty worldwide. So, but my presentation is really focusing on the how to integrate, the new globally consistent urban measurement to the framework of international poverty measurement. So, building on what Ben already presented. So, this specific paper was produced by several co-authors listed here. Not only me and Ben, Mark Roberts, and some other colleagues outside the World Bank who are not here. So let me start with the problem. So, this research paper was aiming to address. So as, because Ben already explained, this issue, I'm really just, briefly explain. So yeah, of course, we are trying to address the, wide variation in urban definitions. And as Ben mentioned, so these definitions varied across countries. So, on one hand, that makes it difficult to analyze, urbanization patterns across countries because they are not comparable, as Ben said. But, another problem this research paper was specifically trying to address is, we also cannot disaggregate international poverty statistics, like extreme poverty, into urban and rural areas, in a globally or internationally comparative manner, because what are the urban areas, rural areas are quite different across countries, right? So, and that's this work is focusing on. But before describing the methodology and also results, I just want to briefly describe the way the World Bank measures extreme poverty, because I'm sure many of you are maybe not familiar with this approach. So World Bank, measures and monitors extreme poverty based on the extreme poverty line of $2.15 per capita per day. And so the poverty head-to-count ratio, or the poverty rate, is the percentage of people living in poverty, right, based on the poverty line. And we measure this based on the household either income or consumption expenditures, but in many countries, basically consumption expenditure, particularly the countries our work is focusing on. But those household consumption expenditures are expressed in real terms, meaning they are adjusted for inflation and also spatial price variation, because cost of living differs across, of course, between urban and rural areas or across regions, right? So typically, expenditures are adjusted based on the spatial price differators. And also, each country's currency is converted using the purchasing power parities 2017 PPP. So this is just a brief review of the way we measure global poverty. And then, once you measure poverty at the national level across countries, what you want to do is basically you want to measure also poverty rates in urban areas and rural areas across countries, and also you want to know how much kind of poor people, for example, live in urban areas in Africa or some other regions or worldwide and the rural areas, right? But actually, that sounds a simple question, but it's really not straightforward to answer. Because of the lack of comparable urban definitions available in the household survey, budget survey data. So, and that's what this paper is going to address. But I just want to mention here, of course, some previous studies have addressed or examined the relationship between urbanization and poverty from an international perspective. I just want to mention two studies here. One of them is by Martin Ravario and others, 2007. So they examined to what extent poverty was urbanizing, so using household budget survey data from more than 90 countries, between 1993 and 2002. So that was a really important work. And another one is, Ferre and others, 2012, which examined to what extent, poverty, which is actually measured by each country's national poverty line instead of international poverty. But poverty, to what extent poverty varies by the city population size across 8 low and middle income countries. But these studies are very important, but they didn't really address this lack of comparable urban definition problem. So they just used each country's urban-rural definition. So, but instead, our approach is to integrate globally or internationally consistent urban measurement approaches to the framework of international poverty estimation. And as Ben already introduced, we're going to focus on 2 urban classification approaches, so the degree of urbanization and the dartboard approaches. And so here, this is a summary of our steps. So basically, we applied, as Ben already showed, we applied either degree of urbanization or dartboard classification to some gridded population layers, like a world pop or GHS pop. They are freely available. And then, so we overlaid those gridded layers with DOU or DB classification with each country's household survey microdata using the geolocation information available in those microdata sets. For example, some countries, we were lucky enough to access household level GPS coordinates, or some GPS coordinates of enumeration areas, or in some cases a little bit higher, like a neighborhood shapefiles, for example, we used. So, but whatever geographic information we have, we can use it to merge and combine the gridded layers and household survey microdata. And then we updated, urban-rural classification in household survey data with the new degree of urbanization or dartboard classifications. And importantly, we also tried to update, spatial price differators prepared by each country to measure national poverty. This is important because when we reclassify urban-rural areas or urban centers, urban cluster, rural areas or urban cores, whatever, we want to also distinguish cost of living, in those places, right? So we updated each country's spatial price differators based on this new degree of urbanization or dartboard classifications. So then, we deflate, consumption expenditures or income, then applying the poverty lines. Or these are a bit old poverty lines. Now it's $2.15 or $6.85. But yeah, to measure poverty. So Henderson and others, 2019. So they actually took a similar approach. So overlaying gridded layers with degree of urbanization with household survey microdata. So they used demographic and health survey, DHS, microdata from more than 40 countries. But key difference is, in our case, we used household budget survey data with which we can measure official poverty. But DHS usually doesn't have the monetary poverty information. That's the kind of key difference. And in terms of the country coverage, so we focused on 16 Sub-Saharan African countries, and with a few more countries outside Sub-Saharan Africa. So in total, 20 countries. So, and so Ben already explained about the degree of urbanization and the dartboard approaches. So I'm going to skip, but maybe I can just quickly mention why we're using 2 different approaches. So let me just check the time. Okay. Yeah, so the degree of urbanization is a kind of absolute measurement approach. So applying the uniform population and population density thresholds to whatever countries, it's a very simple and a transparent approach, and also endorsed by the UN Statistical Commission for International Comparison. So it's so because of that, it's maybe quite natural for us to use this for our international work. But the one issue with this approach is, because they apply this approach applies the uniform threshold for some countries, actually, maybe threshold is too low. Like, when you look at for example, like Bangladesh, like a very overall high density country, DOU classifies Bangladesh almost like an entirely urban, like a 99% urban. So you can't really distinguish, spatial structures within Bangladesh because it's just urban, so based on DOU. That's a bit problematic, in our study. So we instead, or in addition to DOU, we also used, dartboard approach, which Ben already explained about. So dartboard approach is, kind of relative measurement approach. So statistically delineating urban areas based on each country's relative density distribution. So this approach still works for like even countries like Bangladesh because we really look at the density distribution within Bangladesh to delineate, urban areas. So these two are complementing. So that's why we use these two approaches. So we've obtained some kind of similar findings messages, and then in some cases they show different statistics, as I'm showing you in a moment. So yeah, so let me let me show you some results. So this is just a recap of what Ben already explained about. So I really skip, but I want to just briefly mention. So when we use either dartboard approach or degree of urbanization approach, so most Sub-Saharan African countries are more urbanized than previously thought. Compared to Ben already showed, I guess this, but I'm also showing another one based on degree of urbanization. But in either case, basically many countries are more have higher urban population shares compared to the results based on the official urban definitions. But here, as I said, in our work, we updated spatial price deflators. So basically, deflators are normalized to 1 at the national average cost. So like the higher values indicating higher prices. And here I'm showing the variation of the spatial deflators across official urban rural areas and also degree of urbanization places like urban centers, urban clusters, and rural areas, and also dartboard areas like urban cores, suburbs, towns, and other rural areas. So you see a kind of clear pattern here. So obviously, not surprisingly, cost of living is higher in urban areas than rural areas in any of these definitions. But more importantly, cost of living is particularly high in like a denser urban areas. So, for example, look at the DOU. So the price is highest in the dense urban centers, then followed by less dense urban clusters in the rural areas. So you see a kind of gradient here, and also in the case of dartboard, you see also the highest cost of living in urban cores, followed by suburbs, towns, and other rural areas. So, when we measure poverty, so as such, we kind of discount the purchasing power of urban residents because, so we are basically divide, consumption expenditure by this deflator, so to discount urban resident purchasing power. But nevertheless, even if we discount their purchasing power, we found poverty incidence, like poverty rate, is lowest or lower in urban areas, and even like lowest in the dense urban areas. So this chart shows the extreme poverty rates across 16 Sub-Saharan African countries, and disaggregated geographically based on the degree of urbanization categories. So you see, like in urban areas, like green urban centers and urban clusters, so their poverty rates tend to be lower than rural poverty rate expressed in orange bars. So because we use internationally comparable urban definition in the poverty definitions, so we can actually compare subnational poverty within countries, but also across countries. Right? So, and this pattern remains even when we use the dartboard approach. So the poverty incidence tends to be lower in like urban areas, like dense urban areas. So we did a bunch of simple regression analysis to check if this poverty gradient over density remains after controlling for several household characteristics like demographics or education or even like jobs in some specifications. So this is pretty much exploratory analysis, not really addressing any kind of endogeneity issue due to the sorting of residents, for example. But anyway, so after controlling for observed characteristics, we still see kind of gradient. So poverty is lowest in lower in denser areas. And also we look at urban poverty rates based on the different definitions compared to the official definition, like comparing DOU urban poverty rate to the official urban poverty rate, and also same stuff for DB versus official. So yeah, so as you can see, in many countries, urban poverty rates go up if we use new internationally comparable urban statistics, because these definitions assign more, reclassify more people to urban areas, and also people in urban areas now are more likely to be poor because we adjust for cost of living as well. And but then if you compare urban poverty rates based on the DB versus DOU in panel C, we don't really see much difference. So in terms of poverty rate, yeah, the choice of an absolute or relative approach didn't actually really matter. Now, so this is the kind of final result. So now we are turning to another poverty statistics. So among the poor population, how much of them live in urban areas and rural areas, or in other words, the urban share of the poor population, or you could say the urbanization poverty. So yeah, so these bars indicate the composition, geographic composition of the poor population in each country across 16 Sub-Saharan African countries. So yeah, so if you compare the official definition results with the DOU and the DB results, you can see, so the urban share of the poor population goes up in many countries. So in the case of degree of urbanization, the median, urban shares goes up from 13% to 21%. And in several countries like Angola, Gabon, Tanzania, or Uganda, actually already nearly or more than 40% of the poor population already live in urban areas. And also in many in the particularly dense urban centers like Angola, for example, maybe indicating slum population. And if you look at DB results, even higher share of people live in urban areas. So yeah, so basically that's the finding. So based on this approach, we can disaggregate international poverty or extreme poverty into urban rural areas, or more nuanced, dense urban areas or less dense urban areas and rural areas in an internationally comparative manner. But and we showed poverty seems like more urbanized than we previously thought. But it doesn't mean, also I showed, urban poverty is lower than rural poverty rate, but it doesn't mean urban areas, can automatically support more people, to escape from poverty, because, we didn't really address, kind of causality identification issue. So we just showed, correlation so far. So that's the kind of caveat, when interpreting our results. And also, yes. Yeah, I think I have to finish. I just want to mention lastly, so in order to apply this approach, the key data requirement is the kind of geolocation information in the household budget surveys. And actually, this is quite tough to obtain because in many cases, official household budget surveys are really kind of containing confidential information. Even the World Bank, in many cases, doesn't have access to their country's official micro data set, particularly location information. So yeah, so that's the kind of one constraint we are facing, but hopefully over a long time period, so we can add more and more countries to make this a really valuable global statistics. So that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shohei. I will open, the floor for questions, but I would just ask him to add one more piece of information. I mean, you say it's difficult for the bank to get access to these geolocated microdata. How easy would it be for a country to get access to your script to replicate exactly what you did, maybe using the national poverty line instead of the international poverty line? Is all the code and script open and accessible?
Yeah, so exactly. So, even some countries we analyzed, we took a kind of indirect approach. For example, in the case of Egypt, we didn't have access to the location information or even like the coding script, to measure or construct poverty lines of poverty, like Egypt is the case. And so actually we worked with a kind of professor who actually supported the NSO. And we actually sent our do file, a Stata do file, or coding to the professor, and then she actually, ran and then just returned the results, to us, so we can actually update. We still don't have the access to the microdata, but we have the results. And also in the case of Colombia, also they didn't share with us directly, but they allowed us to access, their microdata on their server, like a virtual place. So yeah, so we couldn't download. We just, but we still can successfully, downloaded the final output. So even if we couldn't, download the raw data, so that's a way to kind of working. If we have a good working relationship with each country's, national statistics office, it's still possible to kind of get results by, working together. So even if we don't have a direct access to raw data, yeah.
Remi, you wanna?
Yeah. So I was. So in cities you have like quality of life amenities. You have private consumption and public consumption. In a Rosen-Roback model, you move to a location that has better amenities, and for that you accept a lower wage or higher prices, a higher rent. And so when you only focus on monetary poverty, you only focus on the wage and prices, so you overestimate poverty because these are tend to be lower because people want to move to cities because they want to accept to have better amenities. With amenities, I'm thinking like better schools, health centers, less conflict. So if thinking of MPI and multidimensional poverty rates, all these things will be measured with MPI. When you do monetary poverty, you don't measure these things. So I think the first thing I would say, like if you do analysis like this, you need monetary plus non-monetary in the same analysis. And then your density gradient may be much steeper if you do MPI than if you do monetary. And then sorting is the other question. Like I think in an analysis like this, you need to do the density not the density gradient, your poverty gradient without sorting, and then with sorting, controlling for like the mean Syrian controls, like age, education, all of that, gender, and see if you still get some of that to get more the causality of your poverty estimate. Because right now it's still difficult to know what it means. But yeah, I feel like having MPI plus sorting analysis will make the analysis much richer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Remi. Yeah, so we actually, yeah, actually, so actually, so the second, third bullet point is actually mentioning, but yeah, we also analyze, non-monetary poverty indicators like access to improved water, sanitation, and electricity, and we still found a kind of very steep gradient. So in denser areas, but that's not surprising at all, of course, but in denser areas, people had better access to these basic services, even after controlling for actually monetary income. So in the regulations, we also controlled for monetary income in addition to education and even jobs, but still people have a better access to amenities. But it's also possible to kind of analyze the composite, multidimensional poverty index, combining different dimensions, even including monetary, so the monetary and non-monetary. So the way World Bank measures multidimensional poverty measure. So that's really, that'll be interesting analysis. And in terms of the sorting, so our hope, maybe in the long run, would be to add more countries in multiple time points. So to seek, say, trends, at least we can, look at the more like a dynamic dimension to see to what extent changes in the location is associated with the poverty and the non-monetary poverty outcome. So that wouldn't really solve the sorting issue at all, but that's going to also give us a little bit more kind of additional insight into the patterns of urbanization and poverty. And so far, our analysis is pretty much descriptive and also cross-sectional. Yeah. You
Yeah,
you shouldn't.
It might be a little unfair for me to ask a question. So first, a comment. The data and code, at least for the first part of the project, and I think the code for Shohei's code as well, but I'm not positive, is available on GitHub. We have an open repository. The code for generating the urban areas is there, and I think the code for doing his analysis is there as well. I'm not positive. And then a lot of the urban layer, the data, the output data is on DDH, right? So we have spent some time trying to catalog it properly. I actually wanted to ask a question for you, Shohei, kind of related to what you had asked me, Olivier, about the sort of distribution of the urban-rural poverty in countries, right? Because you're sort of showing national level averages. How much spatial distribution can we get of those differences? Because I would just expect, again, I'm thinking of a place like Ghana, right? Like the capital city is very different from regional capitals, is very different from the very rural north. How much spatial mapping could we get of the sort of the heterogeneity of those poverty estimates?
You're asking me?
Kind of.
Yeah, but I mean, so maybe we can take more questions. So because you are actually part of my team, so it sounds a bit weird. So
and maybe Satej will have an answer to that question in his presentation. So, please.
I'm wondering how you, when you're talking to countries about classifying poverty, and you have one measure which adds the additional category of town relative to other measures which just have rural, urban. Are you trying to convince them that they should also have this additional town category? And it sort of, in the overall percentages, it looks like people in towns have just been reclassified from rural to that group. So I guess I'd like to understand whether we want countries to move to this kind of multi-tier classification, or whether this is just for our interests, that we know that there's differences between very big cities and smaller towns.
Yeah, so pretty much, it's only for our analytical purpose for now. But actually, I forgot to mention about towns in the dartboard classification. Yeah, so towns in this map, for example, being created, towns kind of shown yellow. So they are kind of gray zone of urbanization. So they could be classified either urban or rural areas. Actually, if we look at when I look at household characteristics in those towns, they are pretty much agriculture and rural people. And the key difference between towns and also other kind of urban cores or suburbs. So basically, as Ben explained, these towns don't really have any urban cores. Like there's no high density areas. So I guess that makes a huge difference in terms of the local economy. So that's why many people remain like pretty much agriculture worker, and also having very bad access to basic services, etc. So in our case, so we proposed actually to consider towns as kind of part of rural areas, so instead of urban areas. So because it's if you in some cases actually, also if you look at the dartboard approach, so many poor people actually living in rural towns. So it's actually rural towns, we'd say. And this tells us actually, or even like the countries where to kind of allocate their resources, because there are so many poor people in low density kind of urban rural areas. That's a kind of another volume zone, of poor people. So suggesting some kind of the way to allocate resources. It's just some implications we offer as well. So, but we're not really kind of, as Ben said, we're not insisting or encouraging each country to adapt these new definitions. Each country has its own definition. But for analytical purpose, it's quite useful to not only kind of distinguish urban rural areas, but if we have a continuum, we can see we show this kind of more nuanced analysis. So it's quite useful here.
Yeah, I think there will be a lot of interest in this non-binary classification of urban rural. Your question, Ben, maybe I'll let Shohei answer that, in the corridor later on.
Yeah, we can
I don't want to, steal the time that Satej will take for his last presentation. So Satej Soman is a PhD student at UC Berkeley School of Information. He used remotely sensed data, satellite imagery and digital traces, and statistical and computational techniques to study global trends in inequality, urbanization, and the built environment. Prior to his doctoral studies, he advised governments and NGOs in South and Southeast Asia on COVID policy response, designed participatory urban planning tools for informal settlement activists in Western and Sub-Saharan Africa, and he led engineering teams building data management platforms in the private sector. He also worked at a startup leveraging computer vision techniques for gesture-based interface. He has a BS in material science and engineering, and electrical engineering and computer science from UC Berkeley, and a master in computational analysis and public policy from the University of Chicago. So, floor is yours, Satej.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Olivier. Like he said, my name is Satej Soman, and today I'll be talking about estimating household-level economic characteristics from high-resolution satellite imagery. This is joint work with my colleagues at the School of Information, namely Susana Consten-Lavioslada and Emily Aiken, as well as my advisor, Joshua Blumenstock. To give you a little outline, I'll talk a little bit about what the state of the art is and what our motivation is for pushing economic mapping and poverty mapping down to the household level. I'll talk about some of the data requirements and data fusion that you'll need to do, some of the featureization and prediction methods we've been exploring, some preliminary results, and where we seek to push this work. Before I get into that, I want to caveat that this is early stage work. It's a work in progress, so I wouldn't take the results as definitive of one method or one technique over another, but I think they're promising and interesting and tantalizing results here, so I appreciate the inclusion in this very interesting panel. So I don't think I need to convince this audience that fine-grained and especially timely estimates of poverty and vulnerability are important for a number of downstream policy applications, whether it's simply understanding the incidence of economic growth, understanding the incidence of optimal tax or public finances, or just simply land and tenure management. My research group tends to look at the distribution of social protection, so that's the lens through which I'll be talking about some of this work. But I think I'd welcome comments from people who are focused on some of these other downstream applications. Through the lens of distributing social protection, whether it's cash grants or universal basic income, what's been interesting in the last, I would say, 5 to 15 years is the use of remote sensing and data analysis techniques to generate relatively high-resolution poverty maps. And what's especially useful from a policymaker's perspective is the timeliness of this. So instead of waiting for a census that might be done every 10 years or maybe every 25 years, you can use a contemporaneous survey of the area that you're interested in, and then use remote sensing, whether it's satellite imagery or cell phone data records, as well as machine learning or data analysis techniques more generally, to generalize those results to an area and figure out, particularly in crisis settings, where the most indigent or vulnerable members of the population are. However, when we look at what the previous work in this area has done, there seems to be a little bit of a trade-off in terms of granularity and scale. So if you look at studies that have tried estimating poverty or vulnerability at the household level, the largest studies we could find were constrained to either a single village in Kenya or a single city in China. So very little generalizability, even though that they were able to enumerate an estimate of economic outcomes for a specific household. And none of the approaches at this scale or at this granularity have used deep learning. On the other hand, we have seen national and international scale estimates at the level of individual villages, going below the individual villages to neighborhoods within each village, and even down to the individual satellite imagery tiles, which are about 1 to 2 square kilometers in some of this previous work. Now, this is an incredible achievement in remote sensing, data science, and applied economics. But again, from the perspective of targeting humanitarian aid or cash assistance, there's still more work to be done. And here's an empirical example. So on the left-hand side, you see a typical satellite imagery tile. The white box that encloses these dots is 1 square kilometer. So this is kind of the area of analysis in previous work. And every single one of these colored dots is a geolocated survey response and the associated poverty out of progress index, which is an asset-based index. This survey was done in 2019 by Give Directly, which is an NGO that specializes in unconditional cash grants. In the southernmost region of Bangladesh, known as Cox's Bazar, they surveyed 100,000 people, and in this satellite tile, you can see all the responses for a single village. The redder dots are richer, they have a higher progress out of poverty index, and the yellow paler dots are poorer. On the right-hand side, we can see two histograms. The first is the distribution of PPI scores throughout the entire survey, so all 100,000 respondents, and that's in black. And the second histogram laid on top of that is the scaled density of PPI scores within the tile. Now, there are two things about this that you should take away. First of all, the inter-tile variation, so like the variation just within the households that fall within the satellite tile, is comparable to the variation in the entire survey. And this surprised me. If you think about neighborhood effects or the idea that there's strong spatial characteristics to where poverty concentrates, the fact that like if you zoom in on a 1 square kilometer chunk of the area that you're looking at, you still see enough variation that's comparable to 100,000 respondents. So this makes targeting quite difficult. The second thing you should notice is that the scene average, so if you average out the PPI scores for every single household that comes into, that falls within the satellite tile, you get a average PPI score of about 60, which on a scale of 0 to 100 is actually quite high. So if your policy goal was to target the bottom 30% of all respondents in this area, which I've highlighted in blue, but you say that you're going to use this average PPI score for this scene, you're going to mistakenly classify this entire tile as a relatively wealthy village. So all the blue dots that you see on the left-hand side here are ones that are mistakenly excluded from this targeting exercise. So that's primarily the reason that you would want to go from a satellite imagery tile-based resolution in this poverty mapping to that of individual households. So the goal in this work is to drive the work to that level of resolution and compare expert curated features with deep learning and deep learning based approaches in predicting household level poverty. In order to do that, well, if you're going to use a satellite imagery based approach, you will need some satellite imagery. So in this work, we use Google Static Maps, mainly because it's free, but other options include products from Maxar and Digital Globe, or the various SkySat options. We use imagery scales from Google Static Maps at a couple of different zoom levels. Like the highest zoom levels that that product offers. So the most zoomed out level is a tile comprising most of a village, but the most zoomed in level that you see is basically the individual houses and their surroundings. So if you're looking to do this, the constraint on the satellite imagery that you'd have to use is at the most zoomed in level to actually capture the granularity of an individual house. You would need something that's with the resolution of something less than 1 meter per pixel. So something like Landsat or Sentinel is not appropriate for these kinds of tasks. In addition, we use building footprints to actually identify the pixels that fall into a particular household and calculate characteristics of individual households. So in this work, we use the Open Buildings dataset, which is a model to extract building footprints from satellite imagery built specifically for better coverage in the developing world, especially Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Other options include using building footprint datasets from OpenStreetMaps, Microsoft Buildings, or custom segmentations, or the WSF that we've just heard about this morning. And then the kind of like limiting factor in a lot of this work is that you need ground truth, labeled data that tells you what the actual conditions on the ground are. So here we were able to access the survey of 100,000 respondents in southern Bangladesh conducted by Give Directly in 2019. As we've seen from these other talks, some of the other ground truth data sets that people use include the LSMS or demographic and health surveys. But the geolocated ground truth labels, in an ideal world, you would simply do a spatial join of the geolocated ground truth labels that tell you what the asset index is to the building footprints data set and associate the economic characteristics of the inhabitants with the physical building. In reality, what we see is that the uncertainty in GPS coordinates makes this an actually challenging task. So a simple spatial join isn't sufficient to match people and their associated survey responses to actual buildings. So we've turned to a number of heuristics. In these kind of panels, what you see is the red polygons are building footprints from the data set I mentioned, and the white dot is the actual geolocated coordinate of the survey response, but this dotted radius is the associated uncertainty in the geolocated response. So this is the noise associated with the enumerator's GPS device. In some cases, the actual survey point falls within the building, so we simply assign the survey response to that building. In other cases, that's the middle panel here, what we see is that the uncertainty radius uniquely intersects one building, so we assign the building to a survey response that way. And in the final heuristic, we can see that, look, in a given satellite image tile, there's one building and one response. In this case, it looks like the GPS response was probably in the surrounding field rather than in the actual the bounds of the building footprint. But we think it's reasonable to say that these should be matched as well. So with these heuristics, we get about 20,000 building to survey response matches. And yeah, so these are kind of the key components and key data sets we use in this work. Now, from that, we basically create features and regressors out of this matched data set in two ways. And the first is probably more legible to economists and urban researchers. It's thinking about what domain-specific experts would think about is important for these kinds of predictive exercises. So we calculate things like the building footprint size, the number of buildings in a scene, the minimum distance to a neighboring building. So these are all like computational geometry or topological properties of the scene in question. But then we also use the satellite imagery. So we figure out the number of green pixels, red pixels, and blue pixels, and do some spectral calculations. And we do these calculations not just for the matched buildings, but we calculate it for every building in the scene and take a weighted average as well. So it's not, in case there are any mismatches within a neighborhood, we try to use that as a way to kind of get an average sense of what's going on in a neighborhood. On the other hand, you have a deep learning-based approach. In this approach, there's no real manual curation whatsoever. What we do is we take off-the-shelf artificial neural network models that have been trained on a different computer vision task. In this case, these models have been trained on what's known as the ImageNet dataset, which is about 3 million pairs of standard images that you would find on Flickr, Google Images, things of cats, dogs, flowers, trucks, with corresponding labels. So the neural network's initial purpose was to classify these general purpose, general semantics of images. But what people have found is that the intermediate representations and transformations that the neural network engages in picks up generically useful image segmentation and image classification tasks, operations. So this might be figuring out the textures and edges and patterns and shapes in a given image. And those intermediate representations, which form a fairly high-dimensional feature space, can be used as a set of regressors as well. So we use these intermediate representations or features as inputs to further classifiers. Now, what's interesting is that the explicit featureization approach in this work has about an explanatory power of 12% on the Bangladesh survey dataset, which is comparable to the best featurization, or the best deep learning performance when both of these feature sets are passed to a gradient boost predictor. But what's kind of hard to show in a table form is that the in-sample performance of the explicit featurization is comparable to the test performance on this holdout validation set, which is what I'm reporting here. In contrast, the deep learning performance is very high on this in-sample, it has very high in-sample performance, but relatively low out-of-sample performance. So I think, again, this is difficult to conclude from just this table, but I would say that the explicit featurization for this very small feature set that I've shown you is close to the peak of that performance, whereas in the deep learning-based featurization, there's insufficient regularization, and what we need to do is better understand the regularization hyperparameter space to figure out how to generalize its out-of-box performance, and this is really driven by the dimensionality of these two feature spaces. So like that's why that caveat was at the beginning. I wouldn't say that this is the end of deep learning. I think there's still room for increased performance. But on the one thing that deep learning does suffer from is that the resulting features are difficult to parse. It's difficult to say what it means for feature 5000 in the deep learning feature space to be actually predictive. On the other hand, we can assign feature importances to the manually calculated features. And what's interesting is that the computational geometry features or the topological properties of the neighborhood and the contained buildings seem to be far more predictive of the variation in PPI. So if you look at the 5 most predictive features from our manually curated feature space, there are things like the weighted average of the building areas within a scene, the distance between the matched building centroid to that reported GPS location, the actual building areas of the matched building. All of these are simply geometric calculations. You don't need the satellite imagery. In fact, the first imagery-derived feature that you see is the number of green pixels, which in these peri-urban or rural settings makes sense. If you see more greenery, there's probably it's more agricultural, but that's relatively not as predictive as some of these computational geometry features. So if you want to get started on this as a practitioner, you don't really need to wait for satellite imagery in order to get started. You can get pretty far with a building footprint data set and a survey, which I thought was interesting. In terms of future work, I think we've just sourced higher resolution satellite imagery. We're building more manual features, including things like distance to roads, distance to classified land cover types, such as agricultural areas. We're working on further refinement of our deep learning pipeline, so trying out different off-the-shelf models, as well as further training these off-the-shelf models on our specific data set. And then all the work that I've talked about here today has been done in Bangladesh, but we have access to similar data sets in Togo. So I think seeing what the challenges are in a smaller, denser, and far more urban country would be pretty interesting. So this is my contact information. I'm here all week. Happy to open it up to questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Satej. So floor is open for questions. Ben.
Great work. I always enjoy the sort of call it the Josh Blumenstock model of throwing a bunch of machine learning stuff at the result. I really liked your comments on sort of this curated versus machine learning result, right? The idea, y equals mx plus b, and all these coefficients mean something to economists and to policy implications. I thought you presented that quite nicely. I've got two specific sort of technical questions. Sure. One, you only have 20,000 out of 100,000 points in your sample. Yeah. That's not great. No. That's not a great hit rate. Just as I've looked at a lot of household survey data, that's unfortunate. I wonder. So first, do you know, like, how different are the points that aren't matched, right? Are those how comparable are those samples? That's my first general question.
Sure. So surprisingly, when we look at the distribution of PPI scores for the match subset and the entire survey, they're pretty comparable. Like, I didn't run like a KS test, but like just looking at the histograms, they looked very similar.
Okay. Yeah.
So
good.
like, I think we got lucky there.
Yeah. So the second question has to do with this idea of building footprints and satellite imagery and where and space, right? Where are things, right? Because one of the things, having worked with a lot of building footprint data sets, is that building footprints don't match other satellite images, right?
Yep.
Like the shifts in the building. If I take the buildings, so you're using Google's Open Buildings data set.
Yeah.
How confident are you that it matches your Google Static Maps images?
Yeah, so we were actually able to talk to some of the folks from this team, and it turns out that Google Static Maps was the input for this. So again, we got really lucky that we're using the underlying inputs for this segmentation task. We did a manual curation of I would say a couple hundred of these match attempts in both Bangladesh and Togo, and what we saw was that pretty consistently that the Microsoft building footprints were displaced from the underlying Google Static Maps imagery, or of course you had the Open Buildings footprints which were displaced from Esri imagery. So I spent a lot of time talking about the linkage between ground truth labels and building footprints, but I think you bring up an excellent point that there's another linkage between building footprints and satellite imagery that also needs to be taken into account.
So if you're going to try and do this again with higher resolution imagery, are you going to have to extract building footprints from that to do the analysis?
I think so,
Okay.
yes. So it is more computational work, but I think the interesting thing is that you can set it up as a single task. So it's not just in one deep learning pipeline, you ask what is a meaningful grouping of pixels, and then in another deep learning pipeline, you ask what are the supposed economic characteristics of these pixels. You can do it in one task, which I think is some of the work on segmentation models that's happened in the last couple of years. It indicates that might be a more successful approach. So even though it is more computationally intensive, I think there are new methodological opportunities that opens up.
No, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yes.
Oh, hi. Fascinating work. I just have one question. I really like especially our motivation, right? That if we have a sort of a planner, a policymaker that want to address this extreme poverty things, and you use the example of the tile, that if you target the tile, we're going to be mismatching policy, right? And then you develop this technology that is able to find out this variation within these tiles, right? And one thing that I wonder, if we think about development economics, is that very strong predictors of income or extreme poverty at household levels are things that are not necessarily geographical features, such as, I don't know, the educational attainment of the male, the head of the household, the number of wives in polygamous societies, the number of assets the household has, land, livestock, these sort of things. Do you think that somehow your methodology captures this from the satellite thing, or?
So the PPI score is largely an asset index, but there are some demographic variables such as the gender of the household head, the number of years of education, number of children in the household. But I think fundamentally these PPI scores kind of conflate consumption and wealth. And really, I would say that even if the survey picks up on wealth, the signal and the satellite imagery are fundamentally stock variables. And I think that's kind of the one of the limitations, that there isn't a visual signal in satellite imagery of what the educational attainment is, right? So that is, I think, even though these two things, income consumption on one hand and wealth on the other, are largely correlated, the visual signals that we see are mainly of the stock variables like wealth. So I think that you bring up a really important limitation. Yeah.
No, I see. I find this with a lot of potential. I'm not skeptical or critical, right? But the thing is that you were showing this, and I was thinking, if we follow this, should we eventually, or would we eventually just assign in a policy to households that hold a lot of land and livestock, right? this was sort of the question I had in the back of my mind, but I know this is work in progress, so that's why I'm.
Absolutely.
This is something to have in mind.
It is work in progress, but there has been other work that combines satellite imagery with cell phone data records. So using satellite imagery as like a first pass on figuring out where broadly wealth and poverty are correlated, but then using cell phone data records from towers that fall into those geographic areas to understand some of the behavioral things. That's actually work that's cited in this paper.
I see.
Yeah.
Cool.
Absolutely.
I don't know if this would help. I think this is so cool. I just love this sort of thing. But when I look at that picture that you have of the household observations, it looks to me like everything is very clustered. And so it strikes me that you don't actually gain that much information from linking each household individually. Like, I wonder if you get some power also because of error in measurement. Like if you place a grid over it and use some clusters of household observations to link to the feature structures, because it looks like the actual ways in which the household footprints relate to each other is more predictive than some of the other stuff you have anyways. And so maybe aggregating more across space would give you more predictive power.
I think that's definitely something that we're looking into, especially on the manual feature approach. Like you say, there is a lot of clustering here. I don't know if that clustering is inherent to the actual distribution, or if that's an artifact of sampling. So if we were to zoom in here more, what you can see is that every sampled location is basically right on the roads. So I think that's driving some of the apparent clustering here. But I think that you don't have to necessarily go down to the household scale. Maybe there's a household grouping scale that actually gets you most of where you want to do, and then in a targeting exercise, you could complement that with community-based targeting or survey-based targeting to figure out within this group of houses, where do you think it should go?
Yeah, I mean, that all sounds intuitive to me. I also think when you actually do household surveys, you often end up in places that aren't actually the household. It's not, the protocol is not perfectly implemented. Right. And so accommodating that makes sense. And I think in many settings where I've worked, actually, there is a lot of clustering by income because of family relationships and stuff. So it just, I think that makes sense.
I think we'll have time for one more question. I would have asked many questions also about sampling implications, how to design sample surveys well to enable this kind of techniques. But last question will be for Thomas, and then I'm afraid we'll be at the end of this session.
Thank you for this nice presentation. I also had one question which goes in that direction of the last question. So you showed that you end up with, let's say, at the end, 1/5 of the potential sampling data. And did I understand correctly that you skipped, for instance, those points that were not, let's say, matching a building?
That's right.
Because I would actually think that you could use them quite well as well, because at least in this proximity, let's say, you have a point that labels also the poverty there. So I think you could really profit from including them as well. But then, you might either check what's the next building to this point and allocate it to that, or give it kind of a likelihood that it belongs to the, let's say, surrounding buildings. And I think if you would train with this, I would actually expect that it gets much better, or can improve the results at least. Because it's a lot of information that you now throw away, let's say, which is still there. And that the spatial domain is correct. It might, within 100 meters not be correct, but even in the proximity, I'm quite sure that it represents the situation there.
Yeah, I think we tried basically running a two-dimensional spline on the survey responses, and then basically sampling the spline at the centroid of the household. And the results were actually surprisingly, there was just a lot more spatial heterogeneity than we were expecting. So I went into this work with neighborhood effects will explain everything. Once we zoom in, we'll have everything, we'll have a relatively smooth spline. But what we found was that the spline was actually quite rough. So some of the intermediate points just didn't make any sense when we tried aggregating some of this information. So I think I think I agree that if we could recover more of the points that we essentially throw away, we would boost performance just based on bigger N. The best way to do that with this particular data set, I think, is unclear. But I do like the idea of maybe using some like weighted nearest neighbors or other approach to kind of recoup some of that lost data. So, thanks.
All that is brilliant. Everything was brilliant today. So thank you so much. Brilliant also for the chair, who only took 2 minutes of your time. So I think Klaus was scared that I would go way beyond. So thanks a lot, to every one of you. Thanks a lot to the, the 4 presenters and all the co-authors, present or absent. And I wish you a very good, interesting day. Thank you.